Almost 20 years ago, an unforgettable swan song adventure debuted on the aging PS2. Shadow of the Colossus in many ways changed what I thought was possible for video games and remains one of my favorite titles of all time. It's a shining example of how video games can deliver interactive art in a way no other medium can. This fascinating experience, developed by Sony and Japan Studio, became an instant classic by challenging established design conventions of the time. 2 decades later, those same challenges are more relevant than ever to the industry. So in this video, we're going to analyze what makes the original version of the PS2 classic so timeless and unforgettable, and why those characteristics are more relevant and important than ever. Please remember to hit subscribe to support the channel for more in-depth retro and current game analysis. The 1,000 subscriber milestone draws ever closer, and I'd appreciate your help scaling that Colossus. A few weeks ago, I published another video on my channel about why the original Metroid Prime on GameCube is still an essential and unique experience over 20 years later, even after the release of the remaster. I was surprised by the support and commentary I received on that video, and it inspired me to consider what other games might share that same sense of timeless vision. Shadow of the Colossus was the first game that came to mind. In fact, I think these two games are similar in a surprising number of ways, but that's a topic for another video. It's worth mentioning up front that, like Metroid Prime, yes, Shadow of the Colossus also received 2 separate remasters or re-releases. A high-definition version of the original came to the PS3 in a 2011 combo pack with its sibling game Ico. This release provided 1080p visuals, improved draw distance, and some modestly cleaned up texture work. However, 7 years later in 2018, we received a complete and beautiful visual remake of the game from Bluepoint Studios. Although the gameplay remained largely unchanged, the entire visual presentation of the game was rebuilt from the ground up. Personally, I think this is one of the greatest remakes of all time, but I also think it presents a somewhat different experience than the original, which we'll come back to in a moment. The original release of Shadow of the Colossus on PS2 is arguably still the most important and iconic, and it's more relevant than ever in today's gaming landscape. Shadow of the Colossus directly challenges almost every gaming paradigm we see today in big-budget games from major publishers. The game consists solely of 16 boss fights scattered around a completely empty, occasionally beautiful wasteland. Your only objective is to find and destroy the Colossi by stabbing through magical glyphs on their bodies that contain their dark life energy. After you defeat one of them, you're transported back to a temple at the center of the game world, and then you're off to track down the next one using light rays from your sword as the only guide. In some ways, the game shares similarities with the roguelike genre, relying on the same loop 16 times with similar gameplay, your skill and understanding of the world increasing slightly over time. Shadow of the Colossus is a fairly short experience, probably 8 to 12 hours your first time, and much shorter the second time once you understand how to defeat each giant. There are no other objectives in the entire game, no minor battles in between the bosses, no towns or side quests, or even other characters for most of the story. There's no DLC with extra colossi or expanded map areas. The story is vague and minimalistic, but also tragic and unforgettable. There's no leveling up, no experience points, no microtransactions, no multiplayer, skill trees, online features, none of that. Just 16 colossi to defeat with your sword and bow, who are really puzzles as much as they are opponents. To be fair, there is a time attack mode with some unlockable items and a hard mode difficulty, but these mostly feel like afterthoughts to the core experience. Shadow of the Colossus prioritizes intricate gameplay interactivity with these giants over endless content and generic systems. Although it seems simple now, the design was groundbreaking at the time in the way it allowed you to climb and maneuver over massive animated models, clinging to thick fur and grabbing onto detailed edges and ledges. In many ways, the game was a technical marvel, and in other ways, it's a technical mess. Shadow of the Colossus boldly focuses all available system power on elements that drive the artistic vision, rather than delivering optimal specs in terms of resolution, frame rate, draw distance, or input lag. The game devotes all available power to rendering these highly detailed, unforgettable colossi that you can dynamically climb over with lifelike interactivity. The giants are covered in dense fur and earthly elements unlike anything else seen on the system. The game makes use of dynamic kinematics to calculate certain physics and impressive animations in real time. Even today, in 2024, I think it would be challenging to find another game that allows for this level of interactivity with enemies 300 feet long. I wish more modern, bigger budget games dedicated hardware resources to super interactive, unique mechanics like this, rather than just bleeding edge visual fidelity in mostly static environments. The open world of Shadow is also beautiful, expansive, and seamless on a system of such limited resources. Your detailed horse runs organically and feels like a living creature when compared to other mounts of that generation. Shadow of the Colossus is a technical marvel artistically, but only in these areas it deliberately prioritizes. It's also worth mentioning this game looks beautiful on older, smooth CRT displays. I think some elements of the presentation are lost a bit when upscaled onto an LED display, for example. Perhaps most controversially when compared to modern titles though, Shadow of the Colossus runs very poorly on the PS2 in terms of pure specs. In fact, almost shockingly bad by today's standards, which are obsessed with resolution and frame rate. This game outputs 480 resolution like most PS2 games, but even at that low resolution, Shadow of the Colossus frequently runs sub 30 FPS, and in especially hectic battle moments, it even seems to dip down into the teens. But honestly, it really doesn't matter. I replayed and screen captured this entire game on an actual PS2, and in the middle of every boss fight, I completely forgot about frame rates and resolutions as I clung to the top of a stomping giant. While I certainly appreciate technically performant games as much as anyone, Shadow of the Colossus still demonstrates that artistic vision and strong game design can overcome most other defects, including performance to some extent. Shadow of the Colossus running poorly on the ancient PS2 is still a far more powerful and immersive experience than many modern games running at 4K 60 FPS. In some ways, the poor performance almost weirdly adds to the experience and creates a unique feel. It's as though the PS2 is struggling and fighting with you to render the frames hosting these giant beasts. The choppy or unpredictable frame rate sort of further exaggerates unforgettable moments like clinging to a giant flying colossus while smoky blood sprays across the screen, and the motion blur and foggy draw distance masks the background and forces you to focus on the battle in front of you. In fact, the draw distance limitations of the PS2 factor into the mood and feel of this game in many ways. Shadow of the Colossus is an impressive open-world game considering the hardware, but the horizon and distant landscapes are constantly disguised by bright, washed-out light or a hazy, blurry fog. Only the world immediately around you is in focus, and this somehow creates a very strong and distinctly dreamlike aesthetic where after you put the game down, you remember certain imagery and feelings drawn from the world experience, but not always vivid details. This is also perhaps the most interesting presentation difference when compared to the 2018 remake. The remake is rendered in beautiful clarity with high-resolution textures and impressive draw distances. I find this comparison sort of fascinating. The original communicates solitude, isolation, and the unknown through that blurry, dreamlike haze, whereas the remake clearly shows you just how empty and how desolate the world is for as far as the eye can see. Although I love the 2018 remake, it's interesting how many subtle technical and presentation differences and details add up to create surprisingly different experiences. It's one of the many reasons the PS2 version remains distinct. If you play the game in the default 4:3 aspect ratio, it also greatly impacts the feel and presentation of the experience. The more limited viewing area actually makes the colossi feel larger because they more easily fill your field of view. In widescreen, you can generally see more of the world around you while fighting the giants, but not so in 4:3. Now, although there is obviously support for widescreen on the PS2, as I've captured here, I believe it's anamorphic widescreen, meaning a widescreen image is compressed into 4:3 and then stretched out again, which doesn't look as good as true widescreen, and it seems to slightly degrade the image in comparison to 4:3. Honestly, it's all a bit hard to tell when using an HDMI adapter run through a splitter and a capture card onto a modern TV. The technical limitations of the original PS2 release also translate directly to the gameplay. Shadow of the Colossus notoriously features significant input lag, even in the remake, since the gameplay is largely unchanged, which some might find almost offensive in today's industry. In 2024, we have countless technologies dedicated to shaving off milliseconds of input lag, yet Shadow of the Colossus couldn't care less. Interestingly, the input lag creates sort of a clumsy puppeteer feeling when controlling the main character, Wander. Wander has so many stumbling and clinging and tripping animations while climbing and hanging on for dear life, and the input lag almost naturally pairs and exaggerates the chaotic process of scaling the Colossi. Part of the challenge of this game is sort of learning the physics and behavior of your character and the Colossi to anticipate jumps, know when to hold on and when to let go, and whether you have enough grip meter left to make it. It's such an interesting feeling when compared to most games today and their razor-sharp focus on precision. I certainly appreciate and prefer how far we've come in terms of polishing gameplay controls, but it's interesting to take a step back and see how a compelling experience can still be built from alternative styles and limited tech. So when you consider the experience of Shadow of the Colossus holistically, I think there are just so many valuable lessons for modern game design and the broader industry. Obviously, there are still plenty of great games being made today, but more and more seem to fall into repetitive or generic tropes and gameplay systems that are becoming tiring. Shadow of the Colossus is as memorable for all the things it does not do as it is for the things it does do. Less is often more when crafting a memorable experience. A few truly innovative gameplay mechanics and level design elements go much further than a large quantity of boring systems. Games don't always need 100 hours of gameplay and endless systems and mechanics and skill trees and filler content to be rewarding. Single-player experiences can often be powerful in ways multiplayer never can. Not everything needs to have live service features or always online functionality. Emotion and story can be drawn from gameplay experiences and the world around you, rather than through Hollywood-style cinematics and long cutscenes. A powerful artistic vision doesn't necessarily have to adhere to specific technical expectations. It's often okay if a game doesn't run at 4K 60 FPS if it delivers a beautiful and memorable experience in its own way. And not every game needs to be a franchise or multiverse. So Shadow of the Colossus boldly stands apart from what defines modern games. Many, if not most of these ideas can still be discovered in the beautiful 2018 remake, which is a compelling place for new players to experience this vision that I would absolutely recommend. However, if you give it a chance, it's the PS2 version that delivers perhaps the most bold and unique version of this experience in its original form. Despite its numerous technical imperfections, its hazy, dreamlike presentation, and clumsy, sometimes imprecise controls, Shadow of the Colossus stands tall in delivering an unrivaled artistic vision through expertly crafted gameplay mechanics and design. Simplicity is often called the highest form of elegance, and Shadow of the Colossus proves that applies to game design as well. Thanks so much for watching, and please hit the subscribe and like buttons to support the channel.